I thought, that's exactly the way Regina sounds when she realizes she's got to go back to school tomorrow. Yeah, I don't know that he was happy about that, but we all have those days, don't we? All right. I think I've given to everyone. If not, Roger has some extra copies. And I didn't keep one for myself, but that's okay. I wrote it, so I know what's there. This is a schedule of what is coming up this quarter. We started a new study tonight, how they made disciples in the New Testament. And so what we will be looking at, some of the examples of conversion. Tonight we will start with the disciples on the limited commission when Jesus sent out the 70. And then I put it up here so we can just kind of go over it. You see Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 8. The other studies this month. And then in May, we'll look at the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, of Cornelius in Acts 10. And then in Philippi, you have the conversion of Lydia. And then in the month of June, jail ministry. Actually, we're looking at the conversion of the Philippian jailer. And then the last two, we're kind of combining some things. Priest in Acts 6 and a magician in Acts 8. And then Samaritans, Corinthians, and Ephesians is the last study. So that kind of gives you an outline, and you've got that. The reason I handed that out is that there were, I heard a couple of people say in the kind of study we're doing, as opposed to like our study on Wednesday night when we're in Colossians, it's kind of hard to know what to do to prepare because it's topical. And so I wanted to give you these. That gives you a passage you can look at. If you're gone and you miss a week, you'll know where we are, and you can have an opportunity to read ahead, to do some preparation beforehand if you want to. So, and I have extra copies of that. Roger, you can just put those on the bookcase if you want to, and pick those up if you need to later. So our lesson tonight, as I mentioned, from Luke chapter 10. And this is the account of the sending out of the 70. Kind of an interesting thing in the Gospel of Luke. Everything starting at Luke 10 in verse 1, all the way down through chapter 18, into chapter 18. All of this is only in the Gospel of Luke. Matthew, Mark, John do not record the sending out of the 70. And there's some other things in those chapters that are only in Luke as well, which is, I think, kind of interesting. It appears that the 70 were sent into Gentile areas. If you'll remember, he had sent out his apostles earlier, and he told them not to go except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But the 70 are going into an area that is going to be predominantly Gentile, which tells you something about the work and the intent of Jesus as it relates to humanity. Let's read together. I'm going to start at verse 1, and we'll read down through verse number 20. I may not read all of it at one setting, but we'll read this together tonight as we study it. Luke 10, verse 1, after these things the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. Then he said to them, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I send you out as lambs among wolves. Carry neither money bag, knapsack, nor sandals, and greet no one along the road. But whatever house you enter, first say peace to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest on it. If not, it will return to you. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not go from house to house. Whatever city you enter, and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you. And heal the sick there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. For whatever city you enter, and they do not receive you, go out into its streets, and say, the very dust of your city which clings to us we wipe off against you. Nevertheless know this, that the kingdom of God has come near you. But I say to you that it will be more tolerable in that day for Sodom than for that city. We'll stop for there for just a moment. I've got about 6 or 7 thoughts based on this passage for us to use as our discussion. And before we get to those, I want to just point out a couple of things. First of all, back up just a few verses to chapter 9 and verse 51. This is when Jesus and his apostles are in the area of Samaria. And verse 51 says, now it came to pass when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent his messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him, but they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. I think there's at least 2 thoughts there. Number one, the direction. He was simply going toward Jerusalem. But I think the fact that Luke says it as he does indicates that there's more to it than just he's going to Jerusalem. He states it's time for him to be received up. There's the indication that he knew what was going to happen in Jerusalem, that he knew that there would be the cross awaiting him there, and yet he had made the decision to go anyway, and nothing was going to keep him from accomplishing that. And so the sending out of the 70 is going to prepare as he is coming through these cities, as he's going from place to place, to prepare for him to come. It may well be that the verses we just read there in chapter 9 take place after the sending out of the 70. That he sent them out, now he's going, and here's a city that did not receive him, just as he said that would be the case. One of the things that is important to notice in a study of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is they are not always intended to be chronological. Sometimes they would take events or stories or lessons or sermons and take parts of them to fit the theme that they're writing about. And so, if John, or Luke rather, 9:51 and following actually took place after he sent out the 70, that's not a problem. It simply is the manner in which Luke wrote these things. The second thing I want to point out, that in verse 1, he says that he sent them before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. And so the limited commission, or the sending out of the 70, was intended as a preparation for the coming of Jesus. And ultimately, their work was about him. And the same can be said about our work. When we go out to take the gospel to people, it's not about us, but it's about him. And the same thing was true as it relates to the work of the 70. All right, so let's, I said I've got about 7, I think it's about 7 thoughts. The first one, from verse number 2, there is a great need. Look at what Jesus said there in verse number 2. The harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. This is not the only time Jesus used that language. Back in Matthew 9, just before he selected the 12, he makes the statement about the harvest, that it is great, but the laborers are few, and we should pray the Lord to send out laborers. Another time that he used that terminology is in John chapter 4. He was at Jacob's well. He sent the apostles into the city to buy food. He waits there. Who came out of the city while Jesus was at the well? a woman of Samaria. And they talked. And he revealed to her the fact that he is the Christ. And as the apostles are coming back with what they've purchased, they see this woman talking with Jesus, and then she goes into the city. And that's when Jesus told them, you say it's 3 months till harvest. Lift up your eyes and look on the fields. They are white already unto harvest. White unto harvest. Was he talking about cotton? Isn't that the first thing that comes to mind, especially if you ever had to pick it? But he's not talking about cotton, obviously. Not first of all, not in that area. He's talking about people. It's very possible that if they had turned and looked back toward the city, they would have seen the people coming out, because remember what the woman was going into the city to do? She said, I'm going to tell everybody I know that I met a man who told me everything about myself. And then those people came out and heard Jesus, encouraged him to stay. He stayed 2 days in that city. And at the end of that, the people told the woman, now we believe not because of what you said. We've heard him ourselves and we know he's the Savior of the world. But in all of those instances, Jesus said the harvest is great, or the harvest is plentiful, but there's a shortage of laborers. And so we should pray God to send forth laborers into his vineyard. I find it interesting in Matthew's account, he tells his disciples that, and then he turns right around and he chooses 12 of them as his apostles. And what will he do with those men? He will send them out into the world with the message of the gospel. This morning, when our service ended, John Holly was leading closing prayer. And in that prayer, he asked God to put people in our path, put people in our way that we could reach. That's exactly what Jesus is saying, that we need laborers to go into that harvest. What does the word harvest suggest about the crop? That it's ripe. It's ripe, it's ready to pick. Now, go back to John 4, for example. They were in Samaria. What was the relationship of Jews and Samaritans? Not good. And Jesus is talking about Samaritan people, and he said, it's time for harvest. It's not 3 months off, it's time now. And so, what about in our day and time and in our area? Are there people in our area who are ready to harvest? But is it not the same problem we have today that they had then? Harvest is great, but the laborers are few. And so he says you pray for the Lord to send forth laborers. But you know what's going to happen if you pray that prayer? You see it in Matthew 9. The men that he told to pray that prayer, he picked them to go. Here in this passage in Luke 10, he tells these men to pray that prayer, and then he sends them out. And if I pray that prayer, I've got to be willing to go out. And so the need is great, and we are the ones who are to be the laborers in that harvest. And so, first of all, the great need. And then secondly, you don't have to do it alone. There's at least two ways in which this is true. How many did he send out here in Luke 10? 70. But how did he send them? 2 by 2. So there were 35 groups that went out, 35 groups of 2. He sent them out in twos. Is that not always the case? I mean, every time you see Jesus sending out people, he sends them out never alone. He sends them out with someone else. The same was true with the apostles when they were sent out. Look at the way Paul goes on his missionary journeys. There's always others with him. Now, it's kind of obvious, is it not, that that is a better arrangement? Some of the places that they would have gone would have been dangerous places. Do we have any of those in our world today? We sure do. You don't go into places like that by yourself. And so having someone with you is always preferable. Larry? Mm-hmm. And, yeah. That's right. I start to say it's common sense. It's not always as common as it ought to be, but it makes sense to do that, and that's what Jesus does. And following that example can solve a lot of problems. Further, beyond that aspect of it, where you may have a weakness as far as this particular topic or thought, somebody else may be able to pick up the slack. I know a lot of times in Bible studies where there was somebody, a lot of times you have what's called a silent partner. They go to the study, but they don't say anything. But if you get into trouble, maybe there's a question you're not sure how to answer, then they can take over. When Jimmy and I went to New Zealand, this was back in 2005, we did a seminar on the home. And after some of those, not every one of them, after some of them we had questions and answers. The very first question that was put to me, I had no idea what the answer was. And so that's what I told him. And so Jimmy was able to get up and he answered that. Had I been there by myself, well, how poorly they would have been from that. But because there were two of us, we were able to help each other out. And so obviously going in pairs is it's a good thing as it relates to your own protection, whether physical or your relation or your reputation. But also it's good because of the fact that you just have a better way of answering or dealing with whatever needs to be dealt with. But now that's not the only way that we don't have to do it alone. Look at what he says in, I think it's verse 1. The Lord appointed 70 to go, sent them 2 by 2 before his face in every secret place where he himself was about to go. And then we didn't read down this far, but in verse 18 and 19. And he said to them, this is after they returned, and they were filled with joy that even the demons were subject to them in his name. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the subjects our spirits are subject to you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. Not only do we have one another when we go out, when we do as he sent out here, but we have God's help and God's presence when we go. Now, obviously, they had something we don't have, right? Power over serpents and scorpions and ability to heal, as he told them to heal the sick and those kind of things. They cast out demons. We don't have those miraculous powers. We still have God's promise that he'll never leave nor forsake us. And while they had something we don't have, we have something they didn't have, don't we? Now, be careful how you hear me on this. They had everything they needed as far as God's message. But they did not have the complete written record. During the miraculous age, the revelation of God was in the process of being revealed and recorded. And so at any place and at any time, what they had was partial. Go to 1 Corinthians 13, and Paul discusses that. But you and I have the entire revealed will, what God intended for man to have. And so when somebody has a question about the will of God, you have the answer. It's right here. You may not yet know what it is. You may have to dig and look for the answer. You may have to go to somebody else and get them to help you find it, but you know the answer's right there. If God intended for us to know it, then it's there. And that's something that we have when we go out that ought to give us some encouragement and some consolation and comfort. All right, so you don't have to do it alone. There is wisdom in going out 2 by 2, or as with Paul, a group of Christians. All right, let me stop right there. You may have a thought over the great need, or this idea of not going it alone. Or you may not. All right, let's go to the third point, and that is there are joys and challenges. We've already seen some of the joy, because when they returned, they were filled with joy. The demons even were subject to them. And I think they're in verse 17, when they said, even the demons are subject to us in your name. That's an indication that they were able to do much more than just cast out demons. He had, in what we'd read earlier, he told them to heal the sick. And so there were those kind of things that they did. So here are 70 disciples, in addition to the 12 apostles, to whom the Lord had given that authority or ability. And as they went out with that message, preparing for his entrance into those cities, they preached that message, they healed the sick, they cast out demons, and it filled them with joy that those kind of things happen. But there are also challenges. He talked in those verses we read earlier. If you go into a house, you say, peace upon this house. If they return that, well, you'll remain in that house. You'll eat what they set before you. You don't try to go to somewhere where they got, a better deal, a nicer house, better food. You stay where you go. But there are some places that they will not receive you. And so there are challenges, are there not? If you've ever tried to teach someone, and Tom, you brought this up, I guess it was Wednesday, was it Wednesday night? Talking about teaching somebody and converted them and thought, man, this is easy. I thought about, and we were running out of time, so I didn't go into it. I thought about in the book Muscle and Shovel, Michael Shank, when they moved into an apartment complex, he set up the film strips, the Jewel Miller film strips, in the common area, and invited all of his friends that lived there to come out. And then he showed them the videos, because he just knew by the time we finished this, I'm going to baptize every one of them. And before the first film strip was over, everybody had slipped away, and he was sitting there watching it by himself. And so sometimes we think, man, this is easy. Should be easy, shouldn't it? But it's not, because not everybody is receptive to it. And so there are times, if you've tried to study with someone, sometimes you don't succeed. It may be a person that you think you want to study with, and that they're not interested. They don't want to study. Or you get to a certain point in a study, and they say, I don't want to go any further. It's frustrating, and sometimes you don't know what to do. I was studying with a young man, raised in the church, had married out of the church, and his wife was very, very hostile toward Churches of Christ. And we had a tent meeting in the area where I was preaching, and some students from Memphis School of Preaching came and set up studies. They went out door knocking and set up studies, and what I got on the card that said this young man had requested a study. After I got there, I drew the conclusion that that may not have been exactly the case. It may have been more that he didn't say don't come, and so they just wrote down you can come. So I get there, and now he was very nice, but I could tell he wasn't all that interested. So we sit down at the kitchen table, and the living room is just right there. And she walks in and sits on the couch. So where I'm sitting, he's sitting across from me, I can see her. And she's sitting there, I think she was knitting. And I mean, she just like, and she never looks up. But she can hear everything that's going on. And so we study, and we get to Mark 16 and verse 16. And I always try to get people that I'm studying with to read. I don't want to read it. I get them to read it. That's just far more effective. He won't read it. He refuses to read that verse. Now, you know what Mark 16 verse 16 says. She's over there knitting, never looks up. And I'm like, what do you do? And so we ended the study. And, I said, it's obvious. We've reached an impasse. If you're not willing to accept what this verse teaches, we can't go any further. And so that ended that study. I don't know if I handled it the right way or not. But obviously, what he thought about it and what she thought about it was very different, perhaps from each other, but it certainly was different from what I was saying. And so sometimes you run into challenges, and sometimes you run into people who say, I don't want to have anything to do with what you're talking about. Calvin?
I watched a little thing on YouTube the other night. A man who has a talk show who's very not nice. And he was so excited to announce that over 30% of the people in this country are atheists now. He just felt, there needs to be an atheist day. He talked about Easter coming and all this, and there needs to be an atheist day. And then you think about the other percentage who believe in God, but it's just sort of an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what things were like in the first century. We have a little bit different challenges because of all the modern things that are in front of us than and I'm not saying that means we don't try to do something, but it's a little different today than it was back then. It's I don't know how many people back then believed in God. Of course, they were trying to convert people who believed in Jehovah God.
Mm-hmm.
The Davidic commission was for the Jews, but it was just kind of distressing for me to watch this man in the audience. Oh, they were just giddy. They were acting appalling and everything because, man, now we've got 30% of our people that don't even believe in God. That's kind of tough.
It is, and I don't know. I've not seen those numbers. That's much higher than what it used to be, and just because he said it doesn't make it right. But I think there's no question that we are far more in that direction than we were, a generation ago. Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about a logical way of thinking, but still there are a lot of people who are like that. And making the comparison, though, between the first century and now is, I think, interesting because even in the first century, Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost was very different from, let's say, Athens or Ephesus or Corinth because of the types of cities that those were. And it's interesting to use the word atheist. The Romans would have referred to the Jews, in fact, they referred to the Jews as atheists because they rejected all of their gods. The problem in the first century wasn't people rejecting the belief in God. It was believing in so many gods. Remember what Paul said when we went to Athens. The King James says, I perceive you're very superstitious. I even saw an altar to the unknown God. And so, a lot of times it's important for us to know our audience. Are we talking to people who are much like us, or people who are very secular and very, tend toward being atheist rather than theist? And it does present a challenge. I think when I was much, much younger, the way that you went about trying to convert people was very different from today. And what worked then, just not going to be effective today. When was the last time that you saw a congregation advertise a 3-week meeting? Some of you remember the days of the protracted meetings, don't you? When it went longer than 3 days or even a week. Why was it so effective in those days? No television. All right, you lay by the crops. You don't have a whole lot to do for a while. And that's when they had the meetings. And they were very effective. And I've heard people talk about those meetings that remembered them when they were much younger and they went to those meetings. And a lot of times those meetings were not effective the first week. But by the second week, when the Word has had a chance to work in the hearts of those people, they began to see those conversions. And, hundreds of people being baptized at a gospel meeting. We don't see that in our day and time. But you did see it in those days because of the way in which they were able to present that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have meetings like that today? But what if we did that? What if we said, this summer we're going to have a 3-week gospel meeting? Who do you think would come? Us. Exactly. In fact, we would count it a great success if brothers and sisters from other congregations came during our meeting. But what about the lost? So those are not as effective, but can we reach the people who are lost today? We sure can. What we've got to do is find the means that does it. The message is unchanged. But the means to get the message to them may have to be different. Roger, you had your hand up.
I don't remember the 3-week meetings. I do remember a 4-week, Sunday through Saturday gospel meetings. I remember those. And we had the same problem they did, referring to people that had all the statutes, all the many gods. They just changed, they don't call them gods. It's called sports, it's called fishing, it's called this, that, it's things that people let get in play. They put more importance on those things than they do on the gospel.
Yeah. And that's a challenge. And that's what Calvin was talking about. That's a challenge. So how do you get around that? And that's the idea. What we can't do is say, well, nobody's interested. Nobody wants to hear, and just give up. And that doesn't work. There are people there. The harvest is there. We just have to find the ones that are receptive. And of course, there are a multiplicity of ways in which to do that. There's one particular way, though, that will never be bested, and that is personal one-on-one contact. Somebody you know, and you talk to that person, and you try to reach that person that way. Tom?
Several years ago, back in the 70s, I was working with a paint company. Now, I had heard right over here at Alamosa, down in black folks were doing that. They were getting the denomination down there. It's been there for many, many years. paint his house, and we'll paint your house for $8 a quart. And so they just painted a little bit on the front of the house. And said, oh, it's done 30 feet. And so he didn't have the money, so he paid them with what value of stuff that he had, and also let them go out in the garden and pick up corn, tomatoes, whatever they had in season. Let them have as much as they want. And so I found out about that. I went out there and talked to him. Make a long story short, I painted the place for it. And I told him he would just buy the paint. I would put it on. And we didn't get quite all the house. We got all the front and the two sides and left the back blank. But so I talked to him about having a Bible study. He was real big in his church. And when I look at that about joys, challenges, I had a joy and I had a challenge all the time. I had gotten him all the way to see that baptism was essential. And he kept putting off, and, well, Mr. Greenwood, I just don't know about that. And I said, tell me what your real reason is that you don't want to do that. He said, well, I've been into the church all night long. And he said, I emphasized too, he understood. Once he obeyed, he would have to come and worship with members of like faith. And he said, I'm so sorry to tell you, I can't do it. And so that became a challenge. So I went and talked to some black brethren in Huntsville. I went to Hartselle, and they just didn't seem hardly interested. Out here in Valdosta, just wasn't work. I tried to get them to come here, but they're all, every time we go out, wherever, there's going to be a challenge. And sometimes they can obey the gospel the first session, and you think, man, this is great. But then there may be 24 times that you fail.
Right.
But we got to keep doing it. We're proactive, not reactive.
Right, exactly. And we're 2 points away from this thought, but let me go up there real quickly. I'm going to pass over this one. No, you're fine, because, well, let's go to this one. I'll just skip over one. We'll go back and pick it up in a moment. The hearer must make the choice. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could make the choice for them? You know what you'd choose every single time. And every time you teach someone, they'd obey the gospel. But we won't get to do that. They have to make the choice. Jesus said, you go into some cities, they'll receive you. Some cities will not. You shake the dust off your feet. The hearer has to make the choice. And then I asked the question based on verse 17, how do we measure success? This is when they came back and they were filled with joy, because even the demons were subject to his name. Jesus said so. He said, that's wonderful, but there's something else more important. But I want to raise that question. How do we measure success? Because you use the term, and I'm not trying to contradict what you're saying, because I would say it the same way. How do we measure success in the idea of taking the gospel out? All right. I think you're exactly right. Typically, we do it by conversions. Ruby said when we plant the seed, we've succeeded. So our job is not to baptize people. Paul even said that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and he didn't say that because baptism is not essential. But he said that because the purpose is to teach. I don't have to do the baptizing. Somebody else can do that. That's what he was saying. When we teach someone, we've succeeded in our mission. Now, do we want them to be converted? Without question, we do. But they must make the choice. And if they choose to reject it, you've still succeeded in what God wanted you to do. They've made the choice themselves as to whether they will accept it or not. And so let me go back and pick up that one. when he sent them out, he said, there's some things you don't take. Money bag, knapsack, sandals, verse number 4. You don't even greet somebody on the road. You keep going on where you're headed. They focused on their mission, and they were dependent on God. Now, when he sent them out later, they took things with them, but on this particular mission, he wanted them to understand God will provide for you. God will take care of you. And if you put your trust in him, he will not let you down. And so when it comes to our work today, obviously it's different because we don't go out like they went out. Even when we go to across the ocean to another country, we've made hotel reservations, we've made transportation reservations, we've got probably somebody on site that can help lead us around and take us around. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, that's some wisdom in doing that. But even then, we're still dependent upon God. And we must recognize that it's God who will give the increase. Much as Paul said to the Corinthians, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And so when we're out, teaching, use, whatever method you're using, the Jewel Miller film strips or Back to the Bible or some other method that you're teaching, or just have an open Bible and teaching out of it. There's where the power is. The power is not in us. It's not on the basis of our being smart or our being eloquent or being encouraging. The power's there. And we must make certain that we depend upon him. We talked about the hearer must make the choice, how we measure success. Let me go to the last one. The real reason for joy. Look down at verse number 20. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that is the power that they were given over things like demons and so forth, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. There's where the true joy is. Because whatever you have here is going to end. Whatever that is related to here and now, that's going to fade. But if your name is written in heaven, then that's something that will never end. Heaven doesn't end. When you get there, that's for eternity. And that's what really brings the joy. All right, let me stop. You may have some thoughts again. Kenny? Uh-huh. I don't know. There are those who think there are levels of punishment and use passages like this. I think what he's saying is you need to recognize, if you're rejecting these people, what that really does. Now, if we get there and we find out that God does in fact have levels of punishment in hell, as long as we're not there, right? And I don't mean that, I'm not in a joking way. As long as I don't want to be there, whether it's the least amount of punishment or not. But I think it's just a way of getting their attention, because you know what God did to Sodom. Well, what awaits you is even worse than that. Because, think about, ultimately those people would spend eternity in hell, but the punishment, the physical pain, all of that is nothing compared to what awaits you if you reject the gospel and spend eternity in hell. Calvin?
The first thing we need to do, and this is for everybody, whether you're a new Christian or old, the first teaching that you do is the life that you live and what people on the outside see of you. That's the very first thing. And if that's all you're capable of doing right now is letting people see by your example that you are following Christ,
Yeah, because your life will undo any teaching you do. Exactly. You're exactly right. All right. Any other thoughts, Larry?
Great Christian lady in Utah. Her name is Drew. She had a husband who was a Mormon. She had 3 kids. All of those kids were young. She brought them to work facility with us. And she talked to her husband. He came and had fellowship with her. Eventually, those 3 kids just wandered away. Her husband died, but Drew remained faithful. She was actually doing fun courses with people across the world. I thought, wow, something else. She never quit.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's always something that we can do. There's plenty we can't do, but there are things we can do, and that's where we need to focus our attention. All right. As we noted, next week, we will look at Acts chapter 2. We'll look at disciples at Pentecost and look at the conversion of those on the day of Pentecost. If you will, turn to number 462. Number 462 for our invitation song this evening. Our adult classes have been studying from Luke chapter 10 tonight, looking at the limited commission, the sending out of the sea, as it relates to making disciples. There's a verse later in Luke 10 that I want us to consider. This is after they've returned. Jesus thanks God for the success of the limited commission. And then verse 23, he turned to his disciples and said privately, "Blessed are the eyes which see the things you see. For I tell you that many prophets and kings have desired to see what you see and have not seen it, to hear what you hear and have not heard it." Jesus was telling those men how blessed they were. We think about the fact that they were in the presence of the Son of God. They heard his teachings. We read the parable of the prodigal son. They heard him say it. They saw his miracles. We are amazed as we read the account of Jesus walking on the water. They saw it happen. They were there. Truly, they were blessed. We should not think, however, that we are not blessed because we didn't get to see what they saw or hear what they heard. In fact, the poorest Christian is richer by far than anyone on the face of the earth who does not have the spiritual blessings that that Christian has. It's true that we didn't see those miracles or hear Jesus audibly teach those lessons, but we have that record and we can build our faith on it. If you're a faithful Christian, you can do things and you have things that this world could never understand. At any point in your life, any time, day or night, you can bow your head and you can say, "Father in heaven," and you can take whatever problem you have, whatever difficulty you're facing, and you can lay it down at his throne. And you can know that he will act in your best interest. You have a family, not just a close family of brothers and sisters. You have a family all over this world. Have the same faith in God and the same desire to go to heaven that you have. You have the recognition that in God's sight, he looks upon you as righteous and justified. Not because of who you are and what you've done, but because of the fact that you're in Christ Jesus and his blood continues to cleanse you of sin. And you have hope of heaven beyond this life. The world doesn't understand the blessings you have. You are richer beyond measure than anyone on the face of the earth could be if you're a faithful Christian. Tonight, as we sing this invitation song, and it raises the question, why do you wait? If you don't have those blessings tonight, why do you wait? That assurance, that hope, that confidence can be yours tonight. You put on Christ in baptism, or if as a child of God who's been unfaithful, you come back to him. That's what you need to do tonight. Won't you do it right now? While we stand, while we sing.
Why do you wait, dear brother? Oh, why do you
just a moment, Caleb Dunaway will lead our closing prayer. Let me mention just a few announcements tonight. We mentioned Cassidy Wisnant was sick this morning. She is feeling better. She's still unable to be out, but keep her in your prayers. Remember, Steve will be going to the doctor tomorrow. Possibility of additional surgery. Doc Garner undergoing radiation therapy. Sandra Davis is undergoing iron infusions. Keep her in your prayers as she deals with this. Lincoln's still unable to be out with us with a broken elbow. I think those are all the ones going through those kind of things. A number of people in our bulletin. Be sure and keep them in your prayers and help them out in any way that you can. Anybody we need to add to that this evening? All right, remember next Sunday is the bridal shower for Anna Claire Gaines. That'll be from 2 to 4 in the annex. She's registered at Amazon, Target, and Bella Vita. Also, we're collecting gift cards for Morgan and Lane, and also Hunter Stevens and Amber Wright. So information about that in the bulletin. If you need any help, you can ask. We'll direct you in the right way. That's all I've got this evening. Anything we need to add to that? If not, Caleb, if you will dismiss us with prayer.
Bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful day you've given us, with the opportunity to set aside time and the commandment to set aside time to worship you and draw closer to you and learn more about you. Thank you for the many blessings you give us in life. Please keep us safe as we go throughout the rest of the week, and let us be the example you want us to be. Help us be doers and not just hearers only. In Christ's name, amen.